Sure. So, welcome to the second session and part three of my approach to counseling methods. So, this is my effort, as I expressed last time, to generate a approach that allows me to integrate what theories I've learned over time with the issues that I face when working with clients. And so, where I went last session was to explore these 9 questions. I see these 9 questions as not necessarily explaining all of life, because I don't think they do. I think there's more yet, but that they get at the core questions that bring people to therapy and need to be addressed in therapy. So, are there more questions? Yes. But these 9 frame out for me the core of what I think I do when I'm working with clients. What I've really appreciated about these 9 questions is the way they frame a kind of a larger look at where humans are. Because when we start thinking about what brings people to counseling, it's typically the question of, well, who am I and how do I do something better? Well, but what does that mean? And by breaking it down into these 9 questions, I think it really helps define what it is going on in therapy. And then, and where this session plans to go, is what I find so fascinating about the 9 questions is that they then help me understand the nature of theory. That is, excuse me, there are lots of theoretical perspectives that are applied to therapy. And what I find is that when you look at them against the 9 questions, they do different things. They look at different components. They bring different windows into what people are doing. So that when you look at the 9 questions, no one theory gets you there. You need to use multiplicity of theories in order to understand what people are facing, where they're going. I have to admit, this is a bit of a frustration of mine that oops, I'll just go back this moment, that it takes so many. I really would like an integrated theoretical perspective, something that takes into account all the components of human life, but yet to find one. And so this is what I've fabricated. And just very briefly before I get into the details, you'll see it is a multi-layered approach where lots of things overlap with other things. It isn't that there's a simple way of blocking things. It's that there are multiple explanations for many things that human beings do. And to really understand, you really need to look at the many factors. How do they relate? How do they guide, interact, frame out, give perspective? So I ask 9 questions, but I have a lot of theories that I then need to apply. So I'm going to next walk through these theoretical perspectives, trying to look at them one at a time and give a little sense of why I think they're important and what they allow me to do when it comes to working with my clients in therapy. Oops, backed up, sorry. So let's start off with the largest framework, which is the nature of our reality as communicative. This is the idea that the world we live in, thinking in terms of the conceptual world, the way we think about the world, understand it, and interact with it in a meaningful way. This all emerges out of communication and communication between people. That is, the reality we experience is something that has emerged between people. And there are lots of philosophers who are working with this. The two that I'm particularly close to are Michael Meyer and Jürgen Habermas. These two, one Belgian, the other German, these two I think have done the most work in terms that are close to what I do. That is, they're very much influenced by American pragmatism. They're very much influenced by the nature of trying to construct useful reality. They do it from quite different perspectives. And then there are a lot of other philosophers out there as well. But the core concept is that reality as we experience it is embodied or constructed, or at least, at the very least, transmitted through language. And we have to think of it as conceptual. That is, we have concepts in the brain and we learn them. and we learn them from our culture. And culture itself can be thought of as a whole collection of concepts. But want to be very careful here to identify that a concept is not just a thing. A concept is a whole basket of things. It includes behaviors, attitudes, ways of seeing. That is, when we're talking about the concepts we use to understand reality, it's not as simple, well, this is a desk. It's no, deskness is a behavior, it's a culture, it's a symbol system, it's a way of enacting, it is part of other structures of enacting. It has certain levels of influence and meaning in culture to say you work with a desk. All of these things are what goes on. And when you think of a concept of desk, it has nothing to do with that it's made of wood or metal and it's sitting there with four legs. It has to do with this inaction of how we function in the world. So, and when we're thinking about communicative reality, language is central. Not that it is only language, because there are other ways of communicating through music, art, the levels of tacit knowledge we build into ourselves. So there are other things going on as well with the way we function, but language is central. It's not the only thing, but it may well be the most important thing. Which means, from my perspective, when you're working with clients, that a therapeutic relationship, you're actually creating a new reality. That is, for both participants, the world has changed. You have, and I'm thinking this particularly for the client. For the client, they have now engaged a new symbol structure that emerges from therapy and brought it into their lives. Okay, and then that includes the concepts and conceptual reframing that the therapist brings. That is both the presence of the therapist, all the concepts the therapist has. That is, there is a functional reality that emerges through simply sitting down with a therapist. Something changes. Doesn't matter what theories they use, what approaches they use, the moment you enter that framework, you've entered into the creation of a new communicative reality. So that's the largest theoretical framework. Within that, I function very much in terms of problematology. And so that's why you get my articulation of 9 questions. That is, the basic understanding of problematology is that all human behavior is driven by problems. Uh, Problems are everywhere. And problematology argues, in fact, this is Michael Myers' point of view, that this is what makes humans who we are. All we are is really problem-solving mechanisms. Uh, it's what we're up to. It's what our brains do. It's how we orient ourselves in life. Now, if you carry on, you'll notice, following the idea that this is a communicative reality, problems always emerge from social contexts. That is, what is the problem you're experiencing? Well, that depends. And it depends primarily on the context within which you experience whatever it is you're experiencing. Something can be a problem in one context, is not a problem in another context. If I'm hungry, that means one thing when I'm out in the general world, but if I'm on a religious fast, it means something completely different. That is, what is the problem changes depending on the context. Now, in that environment, thinking about that, social contexts themselves are a problem. That is, we as humans have to manage ourselves in the context of other people. And that's a problem. People are not easy to deal with. We have to struggle to define ourselves, define what's going on, figure out how to interact so that we can achieve our goals, gain the resources we need, and otherwise function effectively. So it's not that problems are something that kind of drop out of the sky, but the problems are basic to existence itself. And then when you start thinking about that in therapy, it means therapeutic questions and answers are both efforts to resolve problems. That is, when I ask a client a question, and for problematology, questions are vitally important tools. I'm trying to create clarity about the nature of the problem. That is, all question statements embed important components of the answers. That is, you can't ask a question unless you've got an answer platform to work from. So you're immediately merging into the defining the client's reality and helping them gain clarity about it through your therapeutic questions. And then questions to clients require answers. And answers are not neutral. Answers are socially active. Answers are always efforts, at least from problematology's point of view, to bridge the gaps between people. That is, we always express an answer in an effort to close a gap, to end a problem, to bring things together. And in this case, something very important is going on. When a therapist asks a question, or for that matter, proposes an answer, and the client responds, the client is then moving into or toward the world of the therapist, that they're closing the gap by moving into the relationship more tightly. Okay, which might not seem like the best thing, but they're doing something else as well, which is they're learning to give voice to themselves within a particular framework as well. That is, they are learning to define themselves as a self in new terms, terms that are, yes, drawn from the therapist, but ideally are terms that allow them to function more effectively in life. So problematology, as a theoretical perspective, helps explain that what's going on in the therapeutic context is something profound in and of itself. That is, it's part of the basic function of human meaning, the way people function to live. And here we have a particular unit of context within which that takes place and that shapes how they become people. That is, we talked about communicative reality creates an environment in which clients become new kinds of people. Well, now we're talking about not just new kinds of people, but they are shaped by the problems as expressed by the therapist. Every engagement with the therapist leads to a movement towards the therapist and the therapist's mindset and world and concepts and change the client in significant ways. Now, of course, the client can run away and decide to reject, but even if they reject, they've been changed by that process of learning to reject. They've still gained more of a voice of self through that process. That is, this is not neutral. People are being changed by the nature of engaging in problems, seeking answers, asking questions. These things lead to significant changes in who people are. Okay. So those are the framing theoretical perspectives I use. I use them for everything I do, but clearly they're active for therapy. Then I want to introduce neuroscience, which might not be quite the same kind of therapeutic perspective. But as I work with clients, particularly thinking in terms of the question of who they are as selves, I find myself constantly referring to neuroscience and what's coming out of the neuroscientific literature to help me understand what they're experiencing. And so, very briefly, what neuroscience says is it's the human brain that is the matrix of existence. We don't need to talk about a mind. That is, we talk about a brain. And brains are not, again, neutral. That is, it isn't that a brain generates a nice neutral mind. A brain is a thing, and it has evolved to do particular kinds of things. It's evolved in to functionally to help with collective survival. That is, the human brain is a social mechanism for assisting the group to survive, including the survival of the individual, but not necessarily. So, an amazing device in that the human brain is such that the sacrifice of the self is a legitimate concept within the brain. It doesn't reject that as a possibility. Okay, so really a fascinating evolutionary process. and then need to think of it as the integration application of earlier structures. So when we look at the human brain and how it functions, you can see what's called the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain. Those are not accurate statements, but they give you a sense that the human brain shares these characteristics with other brains, other kinds of creatures. We can learn from other creatures what's going on inside the brain in a certain way. We can understand the structures and how they function by dissecting and exploring animal brains and thus gain insight into how the human brain is working. So, really interesting stuff that way. Key then, what is going on from my interest is issues of intrinsic sociality. That is one of the things that the neuroscience reveals is that the human brain is designed for social interaction and doesn't actually function that well on its own. It can't do things without other people. It literally can't accomplish many of its developmental tasks, its learning tasks, without the presence of a family unit, a clan unit, and that in an ongoing context, it needs social environment, social issues in order to feel confident, not feel afraid, and to function effectively. So the sociality is really important. And then it has lots of built-in biases, skews, heuristics, algorithms, quick learning tools, quick tools for learning things, doing things. It also comes up with habits and particular capacities through development. And then something that is important for therapy, that you can look at trauma as a specific network of brain performance. That is how the traumatized people have a different way of functioning as brains. That is, their brain is doing something different. How significant depends, but clearly it leads to a different kind of way of thinking and approaching the world to have come through traumatizing experiences. And then if I use neuroscience, I use it also to frame out things like autism, ADHD, because these are neurological conditions that have a profound impact on the way the person functions, the way they experience life. I was just talking with one client the other day, and my comment was, I think you're a perfectly normal, healthy person who's effectively dealing with life for somebody who's also autistic. That is, the framework isn't that they have problems in living, that is, they've got developmental problems, things that they've learned to do badly, been mistreated. No, it's just autism gives them a particular skew on what they can and cannot learn, how they do function comfortably and where they do not. And if you take those into account, their life makes perfect sense. It's just neurological, it's not psychological, it's not something that at least at this point, I think therapy can treat. Mind you, I have other issues, and there may other be for that person, there may well be other issues that do need a therapeutic relationship. But my comment at this point was go figure out the autism side of you, and I think things fall into place. That's the neuroscience and the way it directs us to think about brains as having their own inherent capacities. We're not minds sitting there neutrally capable of thinking. Instead, we're brains, and the brains do certain kinds of things very well and other things poorly, and brains vary. So we really need to understand what the brain has done, and then to understand that in that context, everything you do in therapy is a developmental experience. That is, it's about a learning. So it's the brain changing. All therapy is changing the brain. No, at what level? And that's an open question, but that's what's going on. So I use neuroscience then as another core background piece, but particularly helpful in understanding the question of kind of who am I in relationship to myself? Um, well, you're a brain, okay? That produces opportunities and limitations. If we move into then more therapeutic theories, I function very heavily within a Bowen family systems theory framework. I don't want to go into this in great detail. I could, and here I need to start expressing my concerns with psychological theories, therapeutic theories, because I find that they are all limited. Where they're limited changes. And that's why I try and draw upon multiple theories. Bowen theory, I think, is one of the largest and most flexible theoretical frameworks for approaching human needs, particularly psychological needs, because it's quite complex and looks at issues most psychotherapeutic theories just ignore, and does a pretty good job of integrating them. So I always see Bowen family systems theory as critical to how I approach people. It's kind of foundational. I can't function without it. What a Bowen family system works from are questions about multi-generational patterns. That is, who people are is not who they are now, but it's the outcome of a multi-generational process. I am who I am because my parents were who they were, who were because their parents were. And if you can understand, well, in my case, grandparents or great grandparents, you begin to understand then parents, which then leads to understanding your own issues in some very important ways. So that's one key issue. Another one that I find I work with even more than the multi-generational issue, much as I do with multi-generational processes, is that we have to think of ourselves as parts of systems. That is, I am a participant in, to follow the Habermas's language, a life world. That is, I am part of a world with other institutions and primarily other people, people who relate to me, who have needs that they get from me, resources they get from me in relationship to their needs, who are seeking things, who expect me to behave in a particular way. And that these systems are greater than us as individuals. That is, you can even sometimes take one individual out and drop another individual in, and the pattern goes on. One of the things I note working with clients is that if they break up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, there's a very good chance the next one will have very similar characteristics. That is, they're looking to engage and continue a certain systemic pattern. The other side of it is once a client starts trying to make changes, they find that the system that they're in, the life system, life world, pushes back, tries to resist change. The forces, it's their homeostasis. So another core component of Bowen family systems theory is that you need to understand anxiety. Huge emphasis on anxiety. Understanding that anxiety is a core driver of how the system performs. Anxiety management is something everybody is trying to do at some level. And so how anxiety is being managed becomes core to what people are experiencing. Are they the focus of anxiety? Are their anxieties focused on other people? How is that going? Where is that going? And then there's another focus within the system is the emotional entanglements of the participants. That is, if I'm feeling better, you might be feeling worse. Or if I'm feeling better, it might cause you to feel better. That is, we're all emotionally entangled. Um, I've noted that it's been really actually helpful for working in the classroom with students, recognizing that students and teachers are emotionally entangled, and that a core part of the teaching job is, in fact, dealing with that emotional entanglement and helping students to use it to learn more. Anyway, this is emotional. We're all emotionally entangled. It's an emotional field. And if anybody's interested in the long term, Murray Bowen actually got that from Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's theory is about emotional entanglements and how all of life is emotionally entangled. Then another core Bowen theory concept that I use all the time is that of relational triangles. Now, Bowen looks at it primarily as a tool for anxiety management, but one of his students, Dan Papero, really looks at it, I think, from quite a different perspective and looks at relational triangles as resources for life. So that if you start looking at how many triangles a person has in their life, you're actually looking at the quality of life. More triangles, more quality. So some really interesting perspectives. To look at these triangles, the way two function together in relationship to a third to maximize the capacities of the two. And then the way those triangles shift happens all the time, all around us. And learning to see and unpack relational triangles is just an absolutely essential component of my therapeutic work. So I do a lot of my work out of Bowen family systems theory. I see it as just the largest single tool for exploring what's driving humans and how they can then resolve the questions that face them. More recently, I've started working with internal family systems theory. This is another perspective. Uh, Richard Schwartz, the founder of internal family systems theory, actually studied Bowen family systems theory, as well as other perspectives, as he was working to develop a framework for thinking about what he was experiencing as a therapist. And one of his conclusions was, after observing people, particularly people who suffered trauma, is that the human personality is not singular, but plural. That is, we are composed of parts, and these parts have semi-autonomous functioning, behave as selves, as if we have multiple selves inside our head that we engage from time to time, or who engage the world from time to time. And for us as people, we just flow between them. We don't even notice we're doing it. But a very attentive therapist can see how we're shift the whole framework of our functioning built around what is really an almost a semi-autonomous kind of personality. So, according to internal family systems, these parts emerge from developmental and other crises experiences. They are always adaptive responses to conditions, and that's a really important point. That is, they are adaptive. They're always about trying to improve the survival of the individual. So now, but what does that mean? They work, that is, to protect and enhance performance in the moment. That is, when we move into a part, it's because there's something about what that part can do that we believe or feel or intuit will help us resolve an issue in the moment. But that doesn't mean they're the long term good for us, because over the long term, they can in fact be quite destructive. If one of the ways I protect myself is to drink heavily under crisis conditions, well, maybe that's fine for the moment of the crisis condition, but I'm building in a habit or a pattern which has very destructive long-term consequences. And the issue here is that these parts are not singular. They don't just emerge and disappear and they're gone forever. That is, they continue over time. They're part of who we are. Uh, they're often, I don't know if they're permanent potentials. Certainly, Schwartz thinks not, thinks that parts can be resolved. I have some questions about that part of the theory. What I think is clear is that they remain active potentials at least until core problems are resolved. That is, parts may disappear, may be resolved if there's a sense that the core issues that drove them have been resolved in the client's life. So, internal family systems theory says this is universal. Everybody's got them. I am not certain that that is the case. But what I will say is they have become an absolutely essential tool as I work with clients who've experienced trauma or have really intense family of origin dynamics, and typically are also highly imaginative. Now, the internal family systems theory people believe that, in fact, everyone has parts no matter what, they just take different forms. And I actually think that, yes, they take forms and that everyone might have the potential for parts, but that what they really are is indicative more of trauma. So that, for example, many of my clients have experienced sexual abuse as children, which means they typically have a part that's about 8 years old that is prepared to commit suicide. Why? Because there's something about that developmental stage and those kind of conditions that create a part that recognizes that maybe life is not worth living. There's something that happens at age 8. There's a perspective on the world, and so there's a part often that is prepared to die. little bit scary to be working with them. But once you recognize them and recognize also that it is an adaptive response, it is a response directed towards maintaining self-control, self-management, then you can work with it and say, okay, so my sense is there's a childlike part of you that just doesn't see the point in going on, that just life feels completely overwhelming. And you can just see in a client, not all of them, but in many of them, there's a reaction, a sense that a part has been recognized and that, yeah, it can see that. And not once it can see it, it can begin to change too. It can become kind of alert of the larger context. So I find that working with people who've suffered trauma in particular, I end up not in every case, but moving towards an internal family systems perspective. It gets at the nature of the self in some very important ways. I actually think it integrates very well with Bowen family systems theory because Bowen theory has a concept of the person who is not a self. That is, they don't have a strong integrity as a person. And I really wonder about that as being indicative of people who have many parts, who have experienced a lot of difficulty and therefore are kind of fragmented as people. I don't know. I mean, it would take more work and I'm not that worried about it, but this is my thought is that the two are not inconsistent. Um, then moving on, cognitive behavioral theory, and really there are so many cognitive behavioral theories, but I'm just going to use it as a general package of perspectives that argue that behavior is responsive to thinking. Change your thinking and your behavior will change. And there's very good evidence that this is the case. Change your thinking and your behavior will change. So then there's a lot of focus on reviewing thought patterns so that you can understand how you are thinking and therefore begin to change them. You can also do something else, which is look at particular fears, dig them out, examine them closely, and then desensitize yourself to them so that you reframe them as not so fearful. Anxiety itself, one of those major sources of problems in the way people behave, it can be examined and then reduced by being carefully thought about, contextualized, bringing various resources to bear on it, and anxiety drops. And finally, you can articulate, a more active kind of sense of goals. You can guide your behavior over the long term far more effectively using this kind of perspective. So this turns out to be a very useful approach, but it's all about the future. Where do you want to go from here? I find that cognitive behavioral theories don't help a lot of clients who have, again, experienced trauma and deep difficulties because it's about changing things that are so deeply rooted that they actually require other theoretical perspectives to help people work with them. Now, again, I note that I think there's a lot of integration possible between cognitive approaches, cognitive behavioral approaches, and Bowen theory, or for that matter, internal family systems theory. I do not see them as contradictory, simply as different types of perspective to be brought to bear depending on where the client is in their process, what they're working at, what problems they're facing. So it's like you move between these core theoretical perspectives over time as you relate particular issues and where the client is and what they're trying to accomplish. So a cognitive behavioral approach, I don't know how you can function without it. And but then I don't know how you function without Bowen family systems approach either. And in some cases, I can't imagine functioning without internal family systems theory as well. So it's like depending on the client, you need to and where they're at and what they're trying to work at, the different theoretical perspectives bring to bear some very useful tools for understanding, helping the client understand, cope, and change. Now, I also find myself drawing upon critical theory. And one of my frustrations with psychodynamic theories, which is what the others are, is that they tend to obliterate, miss, avoid, or sidestep the way human behavior and identity is shaped by the external forces of our world. That is, you need to think carefully about race, gender, class, caste, or issues of economics, demography, education. These are real and they have a real impact on the person, what they can do, what they experience, the opportunities open. It's like all of these shape human identity in very important ways. And these are real things, they have real outcomes. And human beings are not neutral minds, self actualizing entities that can exist within the framework. No, they are identifiable as belonging to these categories because these categories really shape the fundamentals of who they are and what they can think and what they can do. So every question, in some respects, is addressed by issues of critical theory. I find, though, that I think it's more useful for understanding where people are and where they came from, less so where they can go. And I want to be very careful here, not that it eliminates that, and really it doesn't, but that once people are aware of these factors, they can typically start, under some conditions, particularly those of the West and liberal democracies, of making them work for them. So it's anyway, the future is more open, at least under some cultural circumstances. And then really important part here is emotions and psychological problems can be legitimate reactions to external forces. If you start looking at what you're facing in the world, anxiety might be a completely legitimate response. So might despair, fear, anger. All of these things can be overwhelming for the individual, but completely legitimate responses to the world in which they live. That is, they might be hurting the person terribly, but why not? I mean, what they're experiencing would lead in that direction by any thoughtful person, let alone their particular composition of their life world. What they're experiencing, how they've lived, this is theirs and cannot be neglected in terms of trying to understand where they're coming from, what they're doing, where they're trying to go. And last, there's the question of meaning and purpose. And here I don't really know what to do. And so if other people have thoughts here, I am most open to it. This last of the 9 questions. Where do I go in relationship to the world? Now, the question of meaning and purpose is bigger than just that. But this is where it typically emerges with the most impact upon a particular client. Now, meaning and purpose, these are the ancient philosophical questions that have been asked for millennia. What is the meaning and purpose of my life, or of our society, our culture? That is, these are just classic questions. We need to have some sense of meaning and purpose. Maybe. I don't know. So this is a game where it gets tricky. Regardless, we can think of it though, if you're going to live forward in life, you need some sense of meaning and purpose. You need to have answered at a certain level the question, what is this for? What am I for? What am I trying to accomplish? You can't only live there. I mean, there are 8 other questions that need answers too, some very practical ones. But as you move forward into the world, this one needs some kind of answer, particularly for career satisfaction. If you don't have an answer, you don't really get career satisfaction. And this gets to an interesting issue. I mean, I put it down here that it's the ghost that haunts most lives. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of which is it isn't until you're older, typically in your 60s, that you've had enough life experience to really get a sense of, well, is my meaning? What is my purpose? I've done enough to get a feeling for it. So that when you're younger, you're kind of living in this anxious state where you don't have enough life experience to be able to know what you're really answering. But then there's another side to this that as I've worked with clients, I find that this is the most difficult question for people to work with. And I'm really caught here. I don't know why that is the case. Maybe it's because it is, in some respects, the least relevant. That is, as long as you have good relationships, a strong sense of self, you can function. But where are you going to go? Okay, still important question. Or you end up buffeted by life, pushed around when you could be pushing forward. So this one sort of sits as an open question for me, one where I don't have a really good sense of what it means, but theoretically, this is part of human life. There's no question about that. So, so now what? From my perspective, we have to think of theories as tools. That's all they are. They're just tools. No one theory explains everything, and this despite the number of theorists who claim their approach explains everything, or empirically is the best approach. No, I don't find that a useful answer. I think it's better to acknowledge that theories fall short, and we end up at times groping in the dark to trying to figure out what's going on. But theories do help us do certain kinds of things. I find these theories come very, very useful in understanding where people are coming from, what they're facing, where they need to go. Then, but how do you work with them then? So if you've got multiple theories that provide multiple perspectives, then the question becomes, how do you apply them? And my perspective is you apply them in the client's favor. That is, try not to use theory as dominant, even though from time to time it's very directive of how you function as a therapist, but that you're always trying to work from the client's needs or within their capacities or, and very importantly, within their resources, what's going on in their world. You can't push people to try and actualize a certain kind of self if you're not aware of and haven't worked through the issues of the world and what kind of self is actualizable under those contexts. So it's like you need to be pragmatically working with the client. What can they do now? What's the most useful for them now? Knowing that from a theoretical perspective, you may be falling short. Yeah, but a theory is just a tool. Does it help? Use that as your framework. And then I try and also look at what kind of theoretical perspective provides the maximal coherence. That is the closest fit to what kinds of issues the client is facing. And this gets a bit tricky because as you work with the client, you realize, well, it might not be this issue, it's that issue, or they reveal a different aspect of self, or you go, well, I'm running out of ideas here. Maybe I need to shift a perspective. That is, you simply can't find a close fit. I know that I have clients where, well, particularly around issues of trauma, that trauma leads to a very confusing dynamic where people are often not aware of aspects of themselves that emerge in response to trauma, or the sides of themselves that have managed to deal with the trauma have kind of locked themselves up in a closet and they're influencing things from behind the scenes. It's really hard to figure out what is going on. Anyway, so what is the closest fit? Hard sometimes to know. But then once you're working for that, you need the therapy. You can't just give it up and say, well, I'm just going to go where the client is, because as a therapist, you have to have anchors to your questions. So you're not getting dragged around by the client, but instead are serving as a kind of thoughtful anchor in the confusions and problems of their world. So it's always a question of, looking for what functions as the best framework, but keeping an eye on the whole, trying to stay close to the client, but also not giving up on theory, simply because it doesn't seem to be applying. You may need to shift it, and there are other theories as tools, but you want to try and find the place that is maximally coherent. For me, that means I always start out with Bowen family systems theory. It's always my starting place because it approaches the most, that's the biggest fit with the most areas. So it's really a good place to start. But then as you work with the client and you get to know them more, what they're working at, you can shift around again, cautiously, carefully, keeping an eye open to the dynamics, but moving to other perspectives. What I like to think of my own approach is I call it the functional role approach. That is, putting all of these pieces together in my head, I try and look at then what does this whole mean? And I call it the functional role. That is, you need to think of the structure of therapy. If you're going to really think good theory, you have to think about how the pieces all fit together, including the therapist as part of the system. And that's one of the things that I struggle with many of these perspectives. I think of IFS or Bowen theory in particular, or they try and keep the therapist out of the system when in fact once you've started thinking about critical theory and its application, you can't, the therapist is part of the system. You cannot extract the therapist from the system. That's part of the tools, that's part of what's going on. And then also think that the client life world is integrated, changed as wholes. So your job is then to find the critical points of leverage, the points of underdetermination, overdetermination, what's going on in the larger system. Sometimes you can't tell so much what's going on for the client, but you note that their world is changing. New opportunities are opening. People are beginning to behave differently. That is, life is integrated. Um, so make sure you're reflecting on the whole. Don't get caught going down a particular theoretical rabbit hole when in fact the changes are happening elsewhere. So you've got to think a client, it functions as a communicative point in their own reality, working with the other folk in their life world. And the moment they've engaged the therapist, they've got new concepts that now influence the whole. And then I also like to keep in track the one of the things I learned many years ago, that changing behavior is the fastest way to change thinking, change, develop relationships, in fact, determine our capacities. That is, unless there's changing behavior, it's really hard to know what is going on. But once you change behavior, you're actually changing everything. So you've got to think of these roles, how people are functioning. And in that, observation itself is a functional change. Observation is an intervention in the system. One of the things I tell clients all the time is observe, observe themselves, feel what's going on inside of them, observe what's going on around them, observe the structural forces in their lives, observe the relationships in their lives, because the moment they start observing, they will start changing. Observation is a change, is an intervention, because people function in roles, and the observation itself changes the nature of the role itself. So you, in a certain sense, you don't need to worry about theories as long as you're getting observational, because and ideally in the context of theory, because I don't know what you do without it, but you've got to think in terms of functional roles have a dynamic impact of their own, quite aside from any of the theories you're applying. And then the way I think of this, to give it a framework, is I like to think that what I'm trying to do is maximize client agency. That is, I'm not seeking their own self-actualization. I'm not, I don't know what it would be to actualize a self. I'm simply thinking in terms of what can they do to maximize their capacities as a person in the context of their world. So it's like we look at lots of things, and where do we go? Is how do they become more whole as people in the context of the world they live in? And ideally, building clarity around meaning and purpose in life. And so I'm always bringing these questions of meaning and purpose to my clients. As I expressed, I have some frustration around this because I don't see a lot of pickup on these. Yet, for me, if people are going to function effectively, it needs to be in the context of some kind of meaning and purpose. And so again, when I think again of functional role theory, and I've got a whole lot of notes on this that one day I want to write up as an article. You also think then of what are the therapeutic resources that are being brought into the situation. You want to think of the therapist as a social anchor, context for exploration, how the concepts brought can reinterpret, and it goes on and on. That is, the therapy itself is a role function that helps people develop themselves in the context of the whole. So this is my theory framework. So it's like I have all of these theories that I find extremely useful for one problem or another. But then I think there's a kind of meta-theoretical perspective that we need to think about, which is the roles of the therapist and how that functions in the context of the client's life world. This in itself is another therapeutic perspective that ideally integrates all the rest, thinking very carefully in terms of who we are as problem solvers in the context of our communicative reality, but recognizing that when we step into therapy, we're stepping into a role, and that's happening for the therapist as well as for the client, and that everybody is changed as a result of that. We all become different. We have functionally changed the moment we've entered therapy, and theories are tools within that process, good tools, helpful tools, uh, profound tools in many respects, but that we can't use the tool and lose sight of what's going on as a whole, which is the functional changes, the transformations that happen simply because the therapist and the client are now in communication. So that wraps up this second session and my third unit. What I want to do next week is move on to the question of how do I make this work with clients? But I'll stop here and turn this open to a discussion. So I will stop the recording if I can find the recording somewhere up here. There we go.